How do we deal with Old Testament passages like this one? Deuteronomy 20:16 and 17. But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is going to give you as an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. Or God's command to Saul in 1 Samuel 15, verse 3. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. We have these passages in the Old Testament that depict, at least at first glance, a God who is telling Israelites, his chosen people, to destroy not only men, but also women, children, babies, and animals. How do we reconcile that with a Jesus in the New Testament that tells us to turn the other cheek, to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us? We're going to be taking a few weeks here to invite different scholars into the conversation with reconciling this God of the Old Testament that at times seems very violent and has his people do things that, when we're reading it as 21st century people, shock us, and I think it's supposed to shock us. But how do we reconcile that God depicted in the Old Testament with the Jesus in the New Testament? I want to read a couple quotes from you. The first is from an Old Testament scholar by the name of Tremper Longman. He says this when we look at the Old and New Testaments. He says, there is no contrast between the Old and New Testaments. While we learn more about God and our relationship with him as we move to the New Testament, the development can be described by words like progress, growth, and deepening, but not correction. We do not go off in a different direction, but rather we go further in the same direction. In other words, the God of the Old Testament is not different from the Jesus that we find in the New Testament. Along similar lines, another Old Testament scholar, John Goldingay, says this: it is customary to see Christ as God's supreme revelation and the New Testament as the record of that revelation. I do not object to that formulation, but its significance needs stating carefully. First, Christ did not come primarily to reveal something new. The First Testament, or the Old Testament, already provided Israel and even the world with plenty of revelation. Israel's chief need and the world's chief need was not more revelation. Christ came to do something, not reveal something. He came to implement God's rule in the world. So Goldingay makes a very specific nuance, which is that Jesus ultimately is, yes, he is the full revelation of who God is, but what we need to consider as important is he came to accomplish something. Our goal in this series is to argue that Longman and Goldingay are correct, that the God of the New Testament is not different from the God of the Old Testament, which means that we need to deal with these passages in the Old Testament that seem to suggest genocide. So we are going to invite more scholars into the conversation by looking at their books and different ways that they have argued to figure out, to deal with, and even to learn from these texts and these what can be very difficult texts in the Old Testament, and see how we can even learn more about who God is and his nature and his character. So I invite you on this journey. Take a look at the next video to explore how we can deal with this issue.